Hey guys, it's Shara from Woodshop Diaries, and in this video we're going to be building an arched door console cabinet. I made this cabinet almost entirely from plywood, which you might have guessed, but it's a super fun build and I'm excited to share how it came together. So if you're ready to dive in and get building, let's go. I'm building these two identical console cabinets for a friend to put on each side of her existing fireplace. She needed these to be built to a custom size, so they're only about a foot deep. Since that's not really a practical size for most everyday applications, I adjusted the dimensions in the printable plans to build this cabinet to a more common size for a basic console. Essentially, it's just a few inches deeper and a little bit shorter. Though the final size is slightly different in the video versus what's in the plans, the assembly process is still very much the same, and the first part was simply cutting down the plywood sheet. I used red oak plywood for the majority of this build. The only thing here that won't be cut from plywood is the base, but we will get to that later. I trimmed 3/4 inch plywood for the cabinet bottom, sides, and top supports. Then I applied edge banding to the front edges of the pieces that will be exposed. Now you'll see in just a minute that the top of the console is attached in kind of an odd way, so that leaves the top of the side panels exposed. So I did make sure to apply edge banding to these edges too. After sanding, I drilled pocket holes in the bottom and top pieces to assemble. It's important here not to drill pocket holes within about a 1/2 inch of the outside edges of the top supports. So on the side panels, I edge banded both the top and the front. So I need to make sure that when I attach the bottom, I'm attaching to the actual bottom since I edge banded the top. Let's see, I like this side better, so I'm going to face it out. Then I assembled the box using pocket hole screws. And I feel like I literally just said this, but I made sure that the pocket holes in these top supports were not within a 1/2 inch of the front or back edges as I attached them. You'll see why in just a minute. I added a piece between the top supports in the middle just to make attaching the divider panel easier. For the divider, I simply screwed this in through the top and bottom instead of using pocket holes. Okay, so I'm building 2 of these and I've got the tops cut for each. I cut the tops the same width as the cabinet, but I cut it 1 inch deeper than the cabinet box. So that way it overhangs the front edge 1 inch. So I'm gonna build a frame that's a 1/2 inch smaller on each side than the cabinet box. That's gonna go in between the cabinet and the top. So it'll be like a little lift. If this seems a bit familiar, you may remember that I did something very similar in a previous project from several years ago. In fact, that project as a whole is almost identical to this one, except for a few details. This, what I'm going to call a spacer frame, just kind of adds some dimension to the project, but it also allows some space for me to be able to open the doors without having to add knobs or handles that will take away from the overall design. So I assembled a frame from plywood strips, then applied edge banding around the outside edges. I also applied edge banding around the top panel too, but edge banding is kind of boring, so let's just skip through that footage. I flipped the top upside down and placed the frame on top. As you can see, Bubby helped me get it in position with the correct overhangs. But once it was time to screw it all together, he seemed to be over it. I attached the frame to the top, then flipped it over onto the console cabinet. Here's where you can see why I needed to edge bend the tops of the side panels and why I needed to make sure that I didn't put the pocket holes too close to the edges of the top supports. They will be seen since this frame is a 1/2 inch smaller than the cabinet on each side. Once I made sure it was centered, I secured it with screws through the top supports. Then I moved on to building the doors. So I've done a video before on sizing cabinet doors. In this case, we're gonna do things a little bit different just because there's a middle divider here and 2 doors are going to share this divider. Normally for full overlay doors on a frameless cabinet, the door would overlay almost all the way. Since I have 2 doors here that are sharing the divider, they can't both cover the whole divider. So they're both gonna cover about 1/4 inch of the divider. So in this case, I'm going to measure from the outside of the cabinet box to the inside of the divider. Now I need to add 1/4 inch because it's going to overlay the front here 1/4 inch, but I need to subtract 1/8 inch reveal on that side, and then since these are double doors, I need to subtract another 1/8 inch for the gap between the doors. So altogether it ends up like evening out. So I need to take this measurement and divide it by 2. I know that's kind of confusing, but basically it's just full overlay doors as normal. It's just not overlaying the entire front here. It's only overlaying 1/4 inch because they have to share the divider. The door sizing here is a bit unusual since 2 doors both overlay the middle divider. But to keep it easy for you, I have detailed all of the dimensions in the printable plans. I trimmed a strip off my 1/4 inch plywood sheet to the width that I wanted my doors to be. Then I trimmed this strip into panels the height I wanted my doors to be. I used a scrap 1x3 to trace along each edge of the panel, then I used a tape measure and a screw to help me trace out an arc at the top. You could also use a large round object to trace this arc if you wanted. Once the shape was drawn, I used a jigsaw to cut it out. I clamped a piece of scrap wood along the edges to run my jigsaw on to help me cut the straight lines. But for the arch, I carefully cut that out just freehand. It's definitely not perfect, but after cutting, I sanded it well and smoothed out any weird spots. Then I cut 1/2 inch plywood the exact same size to glue onto the back. I sanded both pieces well before gluing because it'll be difficult to sand them after the fact. Also, I know that someone will ask what I did to the inside edges of the 1/4 inch plywood, and the answer is nothing. I simply sanded them so that they were smooth. After these doors were glued together, I did apply edge banding to the outside edges, but I will confess at this point I was tired of edge banding, so I only applied it to the sides and the top of each door since the bottom won't be seen. I just gave the bottom a good sanding and left it as is. This concealed hinge jig has adjustments right here. These dials, if you can see, you have the option of 3, 4, 5, and 6, and you've got it on both sides, and both sides need to match. I've got them set on 3, and what this is the distance in millimeters that the hole will be drilled from the edge of the door. So you've got these little stops right here. So when I slide this onto my door in just a second, these stops will go against the edge of the door, and then I'll drill my hole. So basically with me setting this on 3, I'm drilling the hole for the hinge as close to the edge of the door as the jig allows. And this is just to give me plenty of room for the middle 2 doors since they share the divider, I need to push them as far towards the inside as I possibly can. So putting the hinge close to the edge of the door allows me to push that even more in, or as far in as possible. These settings are in millimeters, and honestly the difference between 3 and 6 millimeters is pretty small, so I don't know that it really makes that big of a difference, whatever setting that you were to drill your holes on. Just to be safe, I'm going to drill it on the 3. I drilled the concealed hinge cup holes on each door, but I'll attach the hinges after everything is stained. At this point, I cut and stapled the 1/4 inch back panel onto the cabinet, then moved on to building the base. I mentioned earlier that the base was the only part of this build that wasn't plywood. So for the base, I used solid red oak lumber because I had several scraps lying around the shop. I cut 4 2x2s for the corner legs, and then I cut 1x2s for pretty much everything else. I used pocket holes and screws to assemble the base pieces, but if you wanted to use dowels, that would totally work fine too. Since these pieces were so narrow, I used my Kreg Micro pocket hole jig to drill the holes since it makes much smaller pocket holes, so it's less likely to split. I attached the long braces to the middle support leg first, then I assembled the 2 sides and added those onto each end. Then I stained the bases in Minwax True Black and the cabinet and doors in Minwax Weathered Oak. I figured it would be easier to just go ahead and stain all of these pieces separately before attaching them together. Once the stain was dry, I flipped the console cabinet upside down to secure the base using pocket hole screws in the center leg and 2-inch wood screws at each corner leg. Then I drilled shelf pin holes to add adjustable shelves. I've got my jig here, and this is an old Kreg shelf pin jig. The new ones look a little bit different, but they're the same thing, just a different shape. Anyway, so on this side of the cabinet, I started by just putting my jig flat on the bottom of the cabinet, and then I drilled my first hole right here at the top of the jig, and then I just worked my way up. I did that for this side and this side, so the holes obviously should line up. The problem is that this divider panel, it's only 3/4 inch thick. So if I did the exact same thing on this side, the holes would end up lining up and I would be basically just drilling a shelf pin hole all the way through the panel. Now that would be fine, but if they decided to put the shelves in the same location on both sides, the shelf pin holes, or the shelf pins, won't be able to fully seat into the hole because they'll be hitting each other in the middle, and so it's just not ideal. So I need to offset the holes on this side of the divider a little bit so that they don't run into the holes on this side. So what I did, just to keep things simple, is I took a piece of scrap 3/4 inch plywood, and I'm just gonna start, when I drill my holes, I'm gonna set this on top of it, and then I'll start my hole at the top of the jig. That way the holes on this side of the divider are just basically 3/4 inch offset the holes on this side. And I'll need to make sure that I do that for both this side of the cabinet and that side of the cabinet, so the holes line up and I don't end up with crooked shelves that are sloping downward. And finally, I could add the doors. I've mentioned before that with frameless hinges, there's no such thing as a partial overlay frameless hinge. It's just an overlay frameless. There's adjustment here, this screw right here, adjust it in and out, and I'll show you that more in just a minute, but that is what gives you your overlay amount. It comes as a full overlay, but you can adjust it to where it's only partially overlaying the frame. It all depends on this screw right here. So don't look for partial overlay frameless hinges. Just look for overlay frameless hinges, and then you adjust it how much overlay that you really want. Okay. I screwed the hinges onto the cabinet doors, then installed them to the cabinet. See this gap right here? Pretty big. Needs to be a lot smaller. Right now, this door, you can see there's a little bit of a lip. So we're gonna adjust the hinges to push this door this way to close this gap and to reveal more of this frame. So this screw right here is what adjusts the door left and right.
So I'm going to adjust both the top and the bottom hinge by screwing the screw in. So that's better. Okay, so I adjusted the hinge to push the door this way. So now this divider is not fully revealed, but there's a pretty big reveal here. So now I can add this door.
Now the doors were in place, but will still need a little adjusting once the cabinets get where they're going. For now, I applied a clear coat to the cabinet, which I didn't film because my battery died and I was kind of in a hurry. Just in case you're wondering, I just brushed on a few coats of Minwax polyacrylic, so nothing too exciting. Then I added a couple of shelves using shelf pins to complete this simple build. Honestly, this is such a super simple design. Basically, it's just a box with a couple of doors. But the arch design on the doors really add a nice touch to give it some class and character. I hope you enjoyed seeing how this basic console cabinet came together, and if you'd like to build your own, don't forget to grab the plans linked below. I've got plenty more projects to come soon, so if you aren't already subscribed, hit that subscribe button to follow along. Thanks so much for watching, friends, and until next time, happy building!